Good morning and welcome to the virtual class meeting. So last time we were talking about the process of hybridization, some of the barriers to hybridization, and it's really important to think about the balance of hybridization of related species versus the sorts of barriers that prevent hybridization and therefore allow the gene pools of distinct populations to stay separate, because really it's the isolation of those gene pools that is absolutely essential for speciation to occur, to allow various genetic changes to accumulate in those distinct groups of organisms that will eventually really become different species that can no longer exchange genetic material. So one interesting example of this is illustrated by some sister species of toads. One is the fire-bellied toad, Bombina bombina, and another is the yellow-bellied toad, Bombina variegata. And it turns out that both of these toads live in Europe, but they have somewhat different habitats. The yellow-bellied toad tends to live in highland areas, and the fire-bellied toad tends to live in lowland areas of Europe. But at various boundaries, sort of the transition from the lowlands to the highlands, you actually do see some hybridization where hybrid individuals are formed when the fire-bellied toads and the yellow-bellied toads mate with one another. Interestingly, this hybrid zone is quite narrow. Even though the range of these toads is hundreds or even thousands of miles in these two different areas, in these two different habitats, the hybrid zone is really quite narrow. It's only about 10 kilometers wide or so. And so the question is, why is it that this hybrid zone is relatively stable, and why is it that the hybrid zone is relatively narrow when the range of these toads is really quite large? And if you think about this from the perspective of the hybrids, it might make a lot of sense. So take a second and think about, why is it that this hybrid zone is really narrow? Why doesn't it spread out? Why don't we see a lot of these hybrid individuals at the transition from highland to lowland areas? As we've discussed in class, it turns out that hybrids often aren't very healthy critters. And so in many cases, when you have hybrid formation, their relative fitness, their ability to survive, to eat, to reproduce, is relatively low. So if we look at the distribution of genetic markers that or alleles that are associated with one or the other species of toads, we see this really sharp transition. So as we go from left to right on this graph, you see those yellow-bellied alleles seen in the highland toads are very, very common in their normal range. And as soon as we hit that relatively narrow hybrid zone, the frequency of those alleles really crashes. And just over about this 10-kilometer or about 6-mile distance, we go from over 90% of yellow-bellied toad alleles down to about 10 or 15% of the fire-bellied alleles. So this really suggests that there's something about those hybrids that doesn't have very high fitness. And this is very, very common in hybrid species. Often they're just not well suited to their environment, or they have morphological or physiological problems that really limits their fitness. So that really can lead to this very stable hybrid zone. So while these two species are similar enough that one can fertilize the eggs of the other, as long as those hybrids aren't as successful as either of the parental species, that hybrid zone will likely remain quite narrow, but quite stable. It's probably not going away unless further genetic change prevents those two species from crossing. Here's another interesting example thinking about mating choice and hybridization, and some of the forces that help to prevent hybridization. So here are a couple different species of flycatchers. One is called the pied species, and the other is called the collared species. The collared has this white collar all the way around its neck. The pied species doesn't have a white collar all the way around its neck. And in some areas, we have both of these species living in the same place. So we're going to call those sympatric populations. And in those areas, notice that the pied males and the collared males, tend to have different coloration. The pied males are sort of a browner color. The collared males are sort of a gray-blue color. So in these areas where the females are choosing their mates between these two different but related species that look substantially different, it turns out if a female is presented with a potential mate of her own species, she will tend to mate with that male. If she is presented with a male from the other species that looks different, she won't tend to mate with that male. As a matter of fact, there were no observed cases of sort of the wrong species choice made by females when they were choosing their mates. In these sympatric populations, where the males look different. However, there are other populations of pied and collared males, and they're allopatric populations. So think about for a second, what does it mean if they're allopatric populations of pied males and allopatric populations of collared males with respect to one another? So that means these pied and collared flycatchers live in different areas, right? Allopatric is different homeland or different range. So in this particular case, because they are physically separated, it turns out there haven't been pressures to select for other differences or major differences in their appearance. And because they're geographically separated, it's not a big deal. However, as you might expect, when these two more similar looking species of males are presented to females of their own species, very often females will choose mates from the other species because they look very, very similar to one another. So the allopatric populations of these flycatchers end up looking very similar to one another. However, that's okay because there are geographical barriers. They're found in different areas, so there's no way to make a mistake in mate choice. For the populations of flycatchers that live in the same areas, it's much more important for there to be more significant visual cues about the identity of the species. And in those cases, it makes it possible for females to easily identify males of the same species. So mistakes don't happen.